Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Tom Douglas. I'm the superintendent for this wonderful school district, Bethlehem Central. And I want to say how impressed I am by so many people coming out tonight to discuss the Common Core. Here at Bethlehem Central, we've been going through an educational reform over the past several years. Tonight is one of those nights that we feel very strongly about is making sure that the information is properly presented to our community. So as you go through this evening's presentation, you will hear information about the Common Core, APPR, and our testing programs here, as well as some of the items within the Common Core, within our curriculum, how it will be utilized, and how best we can serve you as parents. So we want to thank you for coming out and participating. I'd also like to thank all of our faculty and staff, our teachers that are here tonight, our supervisors, our administrative team, and our principals, as well as our board members who are also able to share tonight, because this is an important effort for pedagogy for our district, but not only for our district, for the state and across the nation. So as we start tonight, we'll have an agenda that as the agenda goes through, it will start off with the Common Core curriculum. Then we will take a slight pause in between the Common Core for some question and answer session, and then we'll pick up with the APPR. So to get started tonight, because we're going to try to keep this on task and on point as we go to minimize the time, but also maximize our resources. Everything that you see tonight will also be available. One is by video recording on our web, so that if you have neighbors or friends that are out there, they can access that at any time at BCSD website. And then on top of it, our handouts, although there were grade level handouts for this evening, all of those are also available. So if you could not avail yourself of one, you could also go online and make sure that you're kept up to date. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to our Assistant Superintendent for Educational Programming, Ms. Jody Monroe.
Good evening. I'd like to also reiterate Dr. Douglas's comments and really thank you for being here this evening. I know everyone is busy, and we very much appreciate you taking the time and interest in coming to a presentation such as this. So let me just give you an overview of what the Common Core is, and we're going to talk about this more in depth tonight. It's designed to ensure all students are prepared for success in college and the workforce. These are national standards that many states have adopted. They're set clear and consistent expectations for students, parents, and teachers, and there's goals and a clear roadmap that spiral each year. So if you look at the Common Core standards, if you've had a chance to look at them, you can see that the overview standards begin in kindergarten and go all the way up to grade 12, building upon those in different skill sets. And right now I'm going to show you a quick video on an overview of the Common Core to give you kind of a preset to the evening.
When a student sits in a classroom today, they're not just competing with their classmates. They're preparing for a future where they will compete globally, like never before. How do we help them? How do we prepare them for jobs that don't even exist yet? That's a guiding force behind the Common Core state standards, a new nationwide approach to education designed to help students succeed in this 21st century environment. Common Core starts with the end in mind, developing the knowledge and skills students need for college and career by the time they graduate, and then works backward, concentrating on deeper learning and understanding about fewer key subjects. It's not just memorization and multiple choice anymore. It's challenging students to tackle real-world problems, analyze true meaning, defend their conclusions, and think for themselves. We want to help them want to learn, teaching them to be learners for a lifetime. To do this, educators across the country are working together to develop curriculum, create new tests, and train teachers, all by the 2014-2015 school year. It's a lot of work, but what it comes down to is this: the world our students face will require their best. It's up to all of us to help them. That means the whole community: educators, parents, business, and policymakers. The Common Core state standards, developing world-class students for the 21st century.
full disclosure, that was developed by McGraw-Hill. These are the instructional shifts that you'll be hearing a little bit more about tonight. There's 6 shifts in ELA literacy, and there's 6 shifts in math that our supervisors are going to go through with you this evening. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our K-12 ELA and math supervisors, Andy Baker and Dave Hurst, and they're going to take you through those shifts in the Common Core.
Thank you, Ms. Monroe. Thanks, everyone, for coming out this evening. I'm Andy Baker. I'm the ELA supervisor for the district. I'm going to talk to you about the Common Core standards in ELA, a very broad subject, could spend a lot of time on. Of course, we'll just do a brief overview of the instructional shifts, 6 important shifts in thinking that characterize the new Common Core standards. Just as a quick backdrop, though, these standards include standards in writing, reading for information, reading for literature, speaking and listening, and language, and they build on each other as you move up through the years. So starting out, there are 10 standards for writing. The writing and reading standards have 10 each, and each year there's a progression of skills that's spelled out in the core as students move from one grade to the next that teachers can build on. That's an important distinction to be made between previous standards and the Common Core. With the 6 shifts, there they are. I'm going to go through each one, so I'm not going to read them right here. So next slide, please. Someone else is clicking, right? Okay, thanks. The first shift 1 for balance of texts. Basically, this looks at having a reflection of informational and narrative text that students are exposed to in their school lives. Not the exclusive responsibility of ELA, looked at across the content areas to be exposing students to informational text as well as literature. Next slide. Knowledge and disciplines looks at an emphasis on reading text to build cultural awareness and also to read text that is associated with content areas to be able to build content knowledge through reading and through direct interaction with text. Next slide, please. The staircase of complexity. This is not a PE activity. We have students that we want to move them up what the ELA Common Core standards call a staircase of complexity, which refers to basically a growing of a student's reading aptitude or reading skills 1 year in 1 year's time, and to be reading grade appropriate text so that students are growing their reading skills from year to year. They're expected to master more complex text, what they call these text bands are bands of complexity, so that students can, when they encounter difficult text, be able to read it, comprehend it, synthesize it, and do a lot of other more sophisticated things with that text. Next slide. Text-based answers, very important, probably one of the most important shifts, because really what we're looking at here is students pulling details from the text. They really highlight in the core that this is not just students' personal opinions, but how students can back up their ideas with text, with text-based answers, with text-based details, and also being able to determine the validity of authors' claims in arguments and weigh those claims and weigh the evidence authors are using in a more critical manner. Next slide, please. Number 5 is writing from sources. Basically, again, to reiterate the using of evidence from sources and not just personal student opinions in their writing and their reading as they form arguments and as they assess written arguments. And the last one, please. Academic vocabulary has to do with, there are 3 tiers. Basically, tier 1 are everyday words that students use. Tier 2 are academic vocabulary, words that are used across content areas. And tier 3 would be content-specific words that are looked at as in that area of study. And again, vocabulary, a huge thing, always has been, but with the Common Core really looking to expand students' use of vocabulary and ability to determine meaning from context. And with that, I think, okay, I'm sorry. The final slide, go ahead, yep. This is important because this is how it translates to the classroom. And it's just a general overview of the kinds of things you might be seeing and what we're going to be looking to have students do and have been doing as we've been transitioning to the new Common Core standards. And really to go through them briefly or to highlight, What we're looking at here would be students reading text at their level to grow their reading level. Students doing close reading. Very important that we're having students really look closely in the text to unearth meaning. Acquire and use general and academic and domain-specific vocabulary. Writing routinely across the three areas, which are argument, informational, and narrative, and the Common Core puts an emphasis on argument. And what argument means is not so much like fighting with each other, although the kids they do like to argue, so it's a good hook for the kids. But really, it's what we would have called back in the day persuasive writing or opinion-based writing. The shift to argument term happens in middle school. In the lower levels, in the elementary levels, I should say, it's referred to as opinion writing. And also just thinking and writing and communicating more critically about the text that they're interacting with and with each other in the classroom. Okay, so with that, thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Dave Hurst, our math supervisor.
Good evening. My name is Dave Hurst. I'm the math supervisor K through 12 here at Bethlehem. Similar to ELA, there are 6 shifts in math. The first one is focus, which essentially takes the curriculum that we used to do, and it's much narrower and deeper now than it used to be. You used to find that certain topics would be spread out over several grade levels, really not changing what was taught. And the thought process was, well, after doing the same thing for 4 or 5 years, they'll start to get it. The thought process now is really, we're not going to move on until the understanding is there initially and start with smaller chunks of information, but really get to the foundation of it so students understand before moving on. Coherence refers to how things interplay between grade levels. Fluency sort of goes back to math facts, flashcard type activities, but a little bit more sophisticated, but it gets to students being able to compute with both speed and accuracy. Deep understanding, really no explanation needed there. Application, traditionally we refer to these sort of as word problems, but it goes much, much deeper than that now. It goes into, we really want to make sure that the word problems are application-based in that you're not just sort of artificially placing words on problems. They have real-life meaning, real-life applications. And then dual intensity deals with students doing lots of practicing and understanding. So in order to handle the focus piece, the standards are broken down so that each year there's a limited scope in terms of what's being covered. So each grade level has anywhere between 3 and 5 what they call focuses, focal points. So K1-2 essentially focuses on addition and subtraction. 3 through 5, multiplication and division. 6 and 7 really expand into ratios and proportional reasoning, and then moving into algebra. And in the 8th grade, students are exposed to quite a bit of algebra that traditionally would not have been seen until 9th grade. And those of you that have middle school students are probably starting to see, I don't remember doing this until like 9th or 10th grade. So the coherence piece, this is sort of how it looks pictorially building from year to year. K through 5, it's basically broken into sort of 3 categories. You have operations, algebraic thinking, and then 2 different number and operations categories, whole numbers essentially, and fractions. And then as we move into the middle school years, that transitions into expressions and equations, and then the number system as a whole, and then all of that slides into the high school where the focus is algebra. So to sort of give you an idea of what the fluency expectations are within each grade level, this only works if the prior grade level is able to accomplish what is expected of them. So in kindergarten, students are really only expected to be able to add and subtract fluently within 5. And then in first grade, add and subtract within 10, which some people looked at that and they said, that's an awful lot to expect of a first grader. But in kindergarten, if they've already mastered through 5, it's really only an additional 5 more numbers. So then second grade is 20, third grade is 100, and you can see how it builds year to year to year. Whereas in the past, it might have been, you know, in second grade, everybody's doing to within 50, and then the next year we're doing it again because they don't quite know it from the previous year. And then the next year, we better do 50 again because they still don't quite know it. It's much more methodical building process over the course of time. So the understanding piece is really at the heart of what Common Core gets at. Traditionally, math in the United States was taught where students were basically taught an algorithm. You practiced the algorithm a whole bunch of times, and then at the end, you understood how to use the algorithm. You did those problems on a test, and you were good to go. The problem is that doesn't lead to understanding. That just means mechanically you're able to manipulate a bunch of numbers because you know that this algorithm is supposed to work for this type of problem. But then when the situation changes, you're not quite sure what algorithm to use. And if, God forbid, you forget the algorithm, you have no fallback strategy. So the way Common Core works is it really gets at students understanding something. So algorithms are not taught first. Students learn to develop the algorithms through activities so that they can take ownership of what the algorithm is. And then when that happens, you have true understanding, and if for some reason you forget the algorithm, you can go back to, well, I understand this. I can sort of build my way back through the process and develop the algorithm again in my head. And this is a process that is not new. It's from 1986 called Hedon's Continuum. And you start off exactly as you can see in the picture there, students manipulating different objects, be it fraction tiles, it could be base 10 blocks, it could be algebra tiles, working things out by hand until they get a mental understanding of how this process works. They should then be able to move from having to physically have those objects to be able to simulate that using drawings. And once they're able to simulate that using drawings, then they can move on to the symbolic approach. Okay? Because the benefit to this is many students were taught sort of tricks to do things like 3/4 divided by 1/4. I know there's always a saying, keep, flip, switch. So like you keep the 3/4, you flip the other fraction, you change it to multiplication. Students had this memorized. They had no idea why they were doing it. Sometimes they couldn't remember when they were doing it. They just knew this was some trick that the teachers taught them, and it had something to do with fractions. Whereas if you start with the building blocks of doing it by hand, physically and then pictorially, you understand why that algorithm works, and it doesn't necessarily become that you're using an algorithm. It's that you understand what's going on, and it just happens naturally. Okay, so as I talked about in the first slide, application really gets into crossing over into other content areas. It gets into doing real-world type problems, not just sort of simulated manufactured problems. And then dual intensity deals with practicing the math skills so that you become fluent using those skills and that you're then able to apply that in the application problems. And I believe I'm turning it over now to Kelly, who will talk to you about more shifts, but from a teacher perspective.
Good evening. My name's Kelly Ward. I teach 5th grade at Slingerlands. I'm going to try not to be too repetitive in terms of what you already heard from Dave and Andy, but I want to try and give you examples, some concrete examples of how the shifts in ELA and math look in the classroom now so that you might better understand the work your children are coming home with. I teach 5th grade, so my examples are from 5th grade, but I think you can probably think about how they apply to students in all grade levels. So you heard already that there's more of a balance between nonfiction and fiction texts in the classroom, which means that we're finding ways to work more nonfiction into our elementary classrooms. We've always used materials like Time for Kids magazines and other short texts of that nature, but we're certainly looking for more resources so that we can do that. The first bullet talks about a focus on independent interpretation, which means that students gain knowledge from the text itself rather than from the teacher or from the supports we build around a text for students. So we're really forcing students to look hard at text to find meaning. And that's true of both fiction and nonfiction. As a matter of fact, if you look at the standards for elementary ELA, you'll see that they have to apply the same skills to both fiction and nonfiction texts. Close reading. Close reading is a careful, repeated reading of a text to gain a deeper meaning and understanding. And close reading is now going on K through 8. So a close reading means taking a purposeful look several times, many times, at one small piece of text. And that may come across in a couple different ways. Teachers are using more nonfiction text in their read-alouds and stopping and talking more in depth about nonfiction. So we're modeling how it is we approach nonfiction text in our read-aloud time. It may mean that in your child's classroom, 3 or 4 days of reading workshop time are spent on one single page of text. So it's not about the volume of text we're using in our instruction, but about how deeply we can immerse students in a particular text. The curriculum shifts for math that Dave just talked about. One important one is to focus deeply on only concepts covered in the standards, so you're spending more time on fewer concepts. So at first glance, that sounded really great. We won't have as much to cover in each grade level, but like Dave said, the depth of understanding that students need, in particular in something like fractions in 5th grade, is so great that we might spend 6 to 8 weeks only covering half the concepts we used to, but much more deeply. For an example, students are expected to be able to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions in the 5th grade, not only with the algorithm, like he said, the switch, flip, twist, twirl, whatever it was, that trick, but they have to be able to show it on a number line, they have to be able to draw it in a model, and then they also have to be able to do the algorithm. So much more in-depth look at fewer skills. And as Dave said, students will know the math, not just the trick. A great example of this is beginning in 3rd grade, but more so in 4th grade and 5th grade. Students were always taught, and we taught them, that when they multiplied 2-digit numbers by 2-digit numbers, when they got to that second row, they put in what we called smart zero or magic zero, this magic placeholder. And then when they multiplied by the number in the tens place, they just started to move over. And students had absolutely, positively no idea why. So now we spend a lot more time on the why and a lot less time on the trick to solving the problem. And as we mentioned, I think both in reading and math, the curriculum is spiraled or structured so that students have a foundation from which to build upon, which is fabulous once students have actually been through the curriculum for 5 years. One of the struggles we faced is the fact that students in 5th grade last year didn't have the benefit of the Common Core math language and the Common Core math standards to back what they were expected to do in the 5th grade. So once students have been through the core curriculum for a few years, it should be easier for us to focus on some of these new standards. And my last part is about how parents can help. And I'm sure that what you're going to see and hear from me is nothing more than just a reminder for the things you're already doing with your students. The fact that you're here this evening means you spend a great deal of time and consideration with your children and their learning. So one suggestion is to make sure that you sit with your child at least once a week for 15 to 30 minutes, even if they don't need your help at homework time, just to sit alongside them to see what it is they're doing. In mathematics, you can look for word problems in real life, and this is a big focus in the Common Core and found directly from the standards. For example, for 5th grade, doing arithmetic with decimals, like balancing a checkbook. Today in class, I talked to them about adding and subtracting decimals. There's something you could apply at home. When you're multiplying with fractions, you can talk about, for example, what does 2/3 of a 3/4 cup measure of vegetable stock mean? Anything you can apply to recipes and measurements is a great way to engage them in fractions. Using the length, width, and depth of a garden plot to determine how many bags of soil you need. I'm embarrassed to say that we tried this square foot gardening in my family last year, and it took my husband and I a great deal of time to figure out how many bags of what we had to mix. But those are real life problems that you can engage your students in. And in language arts, just talking about books. Talk about the books that you're reading and talk about the books that they're reading, and ask them really in-depth questions, not just how do you relate to the main character in the book? Because as Andy said, the focus is not anymore on the child, the focus is on the text and taking meaning from the text. So deep questions that help them analyze and synthesize. You can model for them reading of nonfiction, newspapers, magazines, online journals, favorite news websites. We did a lesson earlier in the year where my co-teacher and I talked to the kids about different types of reading we do, and I brought in this big bag of all the different books. Books I read to my kids, books I read to be a better teacher of writing. And one of the things I pulled out was my iPad, because frankly I do a lot of my leisurely reading from the iPad, and we talked about the value in that. And why it's important to do reading other than from electronic devices as well. But just having those conversations with them. You can encourage your children to write by keeping a journal, by writing on a blog, and by writing letters to favorite authors or politicians. And you can encourage your children to read about a topic that interests them with high-quality informational texts. A simple thing like when I take my first grader to the library now, we pick out a fictional story, and then we go to the nonfiction section and we pick a book about whatever. We seem to be stuck on becoming a veterinarian. But whatever it is, and then using read aloud time or story time in the evening, even with young students, to read nonfiction text and model for them how you understand it, how you break it down, how you use a glossary to determine words that they don't know. And that's something we probably haven't done as much over the years. I think, Dr. Jen?
Good evening. My name is Jen Gagne, and I'm the Science and Technology Supervisor, and I'm going to let Mr. Petrioni start.
Hi, Nick Petroccioni. I'm the social studies supervisor. Certainly what you've heard today, and Jen and I don't want to be redundant, but we're going to focus on writing a little bit. The big shift in Common Core, at least from our disciplines, is a renewed kind of emphasis on writing. And in social studies in particular, we do a great deal of writing. In fact, we spend a lot of time with all kinds of resources, whether it's primary, secondary, nonfiction, fiction, you name it. We tend to deal with it in a way that I think other disciplines are starting to finally look at it. We also look at things in terms of digital resources, which you really haven't heard a lot about right now, but that's a big part of Common Core as well. So we, like I said, we do a lot of writing. You might have heard the term DBQs, which stands for document-based questions. We do a lot of writing in terms of thematic. When you're looking at revolutions or different themes within certain pieces of writing, we do a lot of position papers and a lot of persuasive essays. I'll let Jen talk about the technical writing.
So these new Common Core standards that we're moving more towards, like Nick said, we've been spiraling towards them and working towards them for a while, especially since the onset 2 years ago, but the students have also been doing these for many years before. So really in our 612 setting, we're looking to include more non-fiction texts, more informational texts, get kids to technically write more. In a lot of ways that we're seeing that in science is by current events articles that students can write about and then also pull details from and then write opinions about. And then we're also seeing it through research. So when your students are doing research projects, they're wading through informational texts, finding meaning in those, and then doing more technical writing. And also through a lot of the lab work that we do, you're going to see your students doing more lab work, in-depth making predictions, doing more writing that's of a technical nature, and this is going to increase over time as they go until 12th grade. They'll be writing a lot more based on lab reports. If we go to the next slide. So we've started this process in science at basically the K-5 level. This is a huge increase for elementary teachers to bring their non-fictional texts up to 50%. So over the past 2 years, we've been phasing in magazine series that have been focusing on nonfiction, that have been connected to the Common Core standards, and all show teachers exactly what the Common Core literacy, strain may be, and then exactly how that gets connected to the reading that they're doing in class. These are very engaging. They're high color. They should be very interesting for our students. They also do carry some online frills with them that the teachers can also use with the students. So one of the series we're using is the National Geographic series. All the magazines we get are levelized, so they're coming in at least 3 or 4 levels to meet all the K-5 reading levels that we have within our schools. If you go to the next slide, this is just an example of how early we start looking at lab work. So this is talking about scientists, the work they do, and the beginning steps of the scientific method. So they have to read this non-informational text, draw meaning from it, and then they start to write about the steps that are there. And this is at a first, second grade levelized reading level. So we are starting very, very young. So we're really trying to get non-fictional texts into K-5 to really assist those teachers and work with ELA so they really do combine together and work nicely. Also out of these texts, there is worksheets and activities, again, directly aligned to our Common Core standards, and they also hit the text that they're going to see on these new Common Core texts. They give multiple choice options, they give short answer responses, and then there'll also be places where they're asked for extended response. So again, they're tying in the writing and the reading of the nonfiction.
As mentioned, Kelly said it really well, that at elementary it's really hard to find resources for students, especially from an historical perspective. So we really went out and tried to find some resources for teachers. This is something that we just ventured into, like a cross contract with another BOCES in Westchester County, where a bunch of teachers got together and put a lot of Common Core lesson plans and resources in one place so that teachers can go there based on their grade level and find a lot of lesson plans and primary sources where they don't have to dig for that material. And there's a whole digital library attached to this as well. So teachers are getting the resources, and we're doing the best we can to give them the tools necessary for their kids to be successful. On another note, I'll just embarrass Dave Rounds for a minute. He's a teacher. He just had a writing workshop for parents, for his parents at the high school related to AP, because he felt it was important for them to understand what their students are expecting, and it was actually went over very, very well with parents. So we're trying to do as much as we can to provide as much information and structure for you, but Common Core is certainly a big part of that, is sort of in writing. So I will hand it off to elementary principals, to Heidi.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Heidi Bonnequist. I'm the principal at Slingerlands Elementary School. And Dave and I are going to talk about some of the changes to the New York State assessments as a result of the Common Core. You heard both Andy and Dave talk about the impact on curriculum, and you'll see many of the same things as I talk about the changes to the assessments. Last year, the changes to the ELA assessments were fairly significant. Many of you had your own children that took the ELA tests and the math tests last April and May, and they could probably tell you that there were some pretty significant changes. I think some of the major changes that you could see right away, first, we're no longer assessing listening. There's no longer a day devoted to listening and responding to those passages. There's an increased focus on having students find evidence from the text and citing that evidence in their responses. And the children are encountering passages and questions that are far more rigorous and challenging than they have in the past. Along with the shifts that are in instruction, there are shifts that are also in the assessments. As we talked about the balance between fiction and nonfiction, by the time children get to 5th grade, there really is a 50-50 split between fiction and nonfiction, and the children see that clearly on the assessments that they take. There's an increased level of text complexity and paired passages. A lot of times there will be a nonfiction piece and then a related fiction piece that goes along with it. One big change with the Common Core and with the assessments is that as kids look for evidence from the text and have to cite them in the answers, they no longer are relying on their own background knowledge. In fact, sometimes their background knowledge about a topic interferes and hurts them in the response that the answers that they're really looking for in the responses to the passages. So that's a big change for us as part of our instruction. The other change is the academic vocabulary. This is a really important thing for kids to know as they encounter the assessments and they know what those vocabulary words automatically mean as they read through the questions and try to respond to them accurately. Words like stanza, main idea, infer, theme, they need to automatically know what the definitions are of those words so that they can appropriately respond to the passages and answer the questions accurately. This next slide shows what the time on task is for the grade 5 ELA test that we administered last year. You can see by looking at them, it's broken down into 3 days. There's 4 sections. The first part is multiple choice. There's actually the same amount of multiple choice questions as there have been in the past. For grades 3 and 4 actually there's about 20 questions less in the area of multiple choice. But the response to literature, that portion has increased for grades 3 and 4. For grade 5, 90 minutes is allotted for the test, and that's an increase from 50 to 60 minutes in previous years. So for grade 5, that's a pretty significant change in the test. Children encounter passages, sometimes they're paired passages, like I said, fiction and nonfiction, and they have to take information from both passages in their written response. This is an example actually from last year's test from the 4th grade ELA. It shows you the increase in the rigor and the text complexity. This is a piece of nonfiction, and there was a paired piece from fiction, something related to this, possibly like an article on Saudi Arabia or a poem in some way related to Saudi Arabia or to this culture. You could see the numbers down along the side of the passage. This is a new feature of the ELA tests in grades 3, 4, and 5. Children are referred to these paragraphs or the sections of the text. Often in the questions, they're asked to take a look at paragraph number 2 and cite some evidence. Or often kids are asked to, in their response, say, in paragraph 2, this is an example of whatever the question is that they're asking. And the last slide is just an example of a question from the 4th grade ELA test. Again, the questions and the text are much more rigorous and challenging than what we have encountered in the past. And Dave is going to talk about the changes to the math.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And I'm Dave Kazanznak, principal of Hammergrill Elementary School. And tonight I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking to you about the changes in the New York State assessments at the elementary level. One thing that has been constant is the students really need to understand the basic facts: addition, multiplication, subtraction. So they really need to have that solid base to be successful. The questions, obviously, if you heard all this evening, they're more complex. The questions require that students have a solid understanding of skills taught in previous years. And the questions also test more than one standard. Before, one of the questions they would have to answer would just be fractions. Now it might be fractions and measurement involved. So students have to have more in-depth knowledge. In previous years, when students took the test, if they needed to use a ruler or a protractor, there would be a picture or a symbol on the bottom of the page or bottom of the problem. That is no longer the case. Now students have to understand when they're going to have to use the ruler or protractor to solve the problem. They will also be given specific instructions on how to solve problems, especially when they need to draw diagrams, create a graph, or a number line to demonstrate their understanding. On the math test now, there's 3 types of questions on the assessments. First kind is a multiple choice. Many of the multiple choice questions now for the children require students to complete multi-step problems. There's also a section for short response questions. The students are expected to complete a task, show their work to demonstrate their understanding. And again, they may have specific instructions, draw a diagram to show their work, and create a graph. I went off script there a little bit, so you can just keep clicking. Doesn't matter. All right, I got it. And the third type of question is an extended response. The students are asked to show their work in completing 2 or more tasks. These questions allow students to show their understanding of mathematical procedures, conceptual understanding, and applications. A typical testing day for a student in Bethlehem. In grade 3, well, everything's changed in 3, 4, and 5. It used to be 2 days of testing. Now we're up to 3 days of testing. For example, in grade 3, they have 50 minutes at minimum each day. It can go up to 70 minutes. So again, students have 50 minutes to complete. At the minimum, they can take up to 70 minutes each day. In the previous years, it was 2 days. One day, 60 minutes, and a second day, 40 minutes. In grade 4, it is 50 minutes in days 1 and 2, and that can take up to 70 minutes if they need to. Day 3 is a 70-minute exam, but students can have up to 90 minutes to complete it. Previous years, testing for 2 days was 70 minutes each day. In grade 5, there's 50 minutes in days 1 and 2. They can take up to 70. And on day 3, it's a 70-minute test, and that could take up to 90 minutes. Previous years, they had day 1 in grade 5 was 60, and day 2 was 50 minutes. Some of the percentage of questions in grade 3, percentage of number and operations based 10, 20 to 30% of the questions on that test have to do with that. 40 to 50% deal with operations and algebraic thinking. 15 to 25% deal with measurement and data. And 5 to 15% of the questions in grade 3 are based on geometry. In grade 4, 20 to 30% are on base 10 numbers, 20 to 30% on fractions, 15 to 25% on operations and algebraic thinking, and 15 to 25% on measurement and data. And in 5th grade, numbers in base 10, 20 to 30%, numbers and fractions, 30 to 40% of the questions, operations and algebraic thinking, 5 to 15%, measurement and data, 20 to 30%, and geometry, 5 to 15%. So there is a lot of changes that are going on in the math curriculum, the math program, the math assessments. Our teachers have really done a wonderful job. Dave Hurst has really done a great job with the in-service and training, getting teachers up to date with the Common Core and the assessments. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Bethlehem Middle School Principal Mike Klugman, who's going to talk about the changes at the middle level.
Thanks, Dave. So as you sort of look up at this slide, I'd love to get a picture as to who's in the audience tonight. Would you raise your hand if you have an elementary-aged child? And if you have a middle-level aged child? And high school? Great, thank you. So it's kind of like, I think, maybe 75% elementary, 50% middle, and maybe 25% high school. Yogi Berra would love those numbers. So if you look up here, this is a graph of something called a lexile, which is a term that's actually been around for quite some time, but certainly made more popular with the advent of the Common Core. So the Common Core is built on something that Andy mentioned called text complexity. And essentially what text complexity is if you take a paragraph of text, you know, how difficult is that for a child to process? So you're talking about a whole number of different metrics. When you talk about text complexity, you could be talking about the vocabulary. So for instance, a paragraph in science does not necessarily equal a paragraph in social studies, does not necessarily equal a paragraph in math. So with the advent of new vocabulary that a science teacher or social studies teacher, or the names and dates that a social studies teacher may be asking students to become familiar with, text complexity is something of an imprecise measure. That said, for those of you that are elementary parents, you're probably familiar with the fact that our elementary schools last year, so in the 2012-13 school year, started a program called Ames Web to get a nationally normed perspective of where their students are with their reading. This year at the middle school, we're doing something similar using a product from the vendor Scholastic called the SRI, Scholastic Reading Inventory. And there's an analog for math that we're also doing. So if you have a child in the middle school in the last 10 days or so, they've taken a test to tell us what their lexile is, which is where their reading level is as a grade equivalent. And as an analog to the ELA, this is an ELA measure. As an analog to that, we have something called a quantile in math, which basically tells us what the grade equivalent in math is, along Dave Hurst's slide that he showed you, which was being algebra ready by the time they go to 9th grade. So if you look up here, you'll notice, first of all, very nice colors, by the way. You'll notice that there's an overlap between grades. So it's not necessarily safe to say that if a child's reading and their lexile is at 1,000, that they're necessarily right on target for one particular grade. They could actually be on target for a number of different grades. And I think the reason for that overlap is what I alluded to by the imprecise nature of text complexity. So again, if you read, I'll give you a great example. My daughter, who's a sophomore, was reading a speech by Robespierre last night. And this was written a long time ago and certainly in front of a very formal audience. So that the lexile for that, I think, was actually greater than a 1210. So that, she's in AP World History, so it's an advanced placement course. So the lexile for that piece of reading was well beyond the high school level. So, you know, as I helped my daughter process that, she needed a little bit of help because there's a lot of vocabulary in there that she couldn't understand. The lexile for that might have been imprecise because the lexile doesn't necessarily look at the student as an individual and assess what their background contextual vocabulary has been growing up. So essentially the imprecision in that is built into this scale. When we say a student's reading at 1,000, they could be right on target for, say, grade 6 or grade 7, maybe even grade 8 or 9. So what we've done over the last 10 days in the middle school is actually assess students. So aside from shortly receiving your child's ELA and math scores on their New York State exams, you'll also, from the middle school and the elementary school as they were doing last year, you'll be getting reports from the middle school and elementary schools about the nationally norm results as to where our students are. Next slide, please. So as evidence of some of the shifts that Andy was speaking about in ELA, I took a look at the grade 7 exam specifically from 2010, and then the grade 7 exam literally from last spring. And I apologize, you know, in talking to a representative from State Ed, I talked to them about whether or not I'm allowed to share this information because, as you may have heard, the tests are secure now. So I want to qualify what I'm about to say by saying I took this portion from the parts of the test that are not secure. So just a heads up on that. So if you look at the lexile measures of these, and actually in our faculty meeting Monday, one of the things I'm doing with our middle school teachers is teaching them how to basically excerpt. You could take a science textbook, take a couple paragraphs from the textbook, copy and paste those into a Word document, plain text file, upload those to a website that you all have access to called lexile.com, so you could do this at home actually. I know you're all going to run home and do this. And you could basically take that text, submit it, press enter, and it shoots back a number to you, which is essentially what I did. I copied and pasted these documents from the test into this online engine, and when I hit the word enter, the dolphin mystery was lexiled at 910, 900 and 790 for a poem. And I think what you'd see with poetry is that there's typically a little bit of a fall in the Lexile because from a context perspective, the comprehension demands of poetry are certainly, I think, in some cases greater. So when you look at the comparison, you clearly see that there's a definite increase that's spoken to in the Common Core. So that shift that Andy talked about in text complexity clearly comes through in that. And that's not something that's going away. In fact, I think when you look at the 3 through 8 assessments, you see that at each grade level, that we're stepping up the complexity of the text that's being put in front of students. And I think we spoke about the fact that that's not just in the type of text that we put in front of students. So it's not just a shift from nonfiction to fiction or fiction to nonfiction. It's also a shift in, for instance, the fiction we might have put in front of students 2 years ago and the fiction that we put in front of them now. And then last but not least, again, the equivalent measure to that Lexile is a quantile for the middle school. There's an equivalent measure that they use for the Ames Web, because Ames Web at the elementary level, it has both math and ELA. And for those of you that have students at the high school level, this shift is occurring literally as we speak. So what New York State is in the process of doing as we speak is upgrading and or elevating the text complexity and the difficulty akin to what Andy and Dave mentioned with regard to algebra. So the algebra exams this year will be different. And then obviously the English exams as we move forward will be different as well. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Jody, and she'll talk to you about the second half of the evening.
What we're going to do at this point is we're going to pause for a second because you may have some questions related to the Common Core or the testing program. So we're going to stop, take a brief break. For those of you who want to ask questions, we have mics in the far aisle and in the center aisle. And I believe some people did have some questions they wrote down on index cards, either as they were coming in or sent them in prior. So if anyone will just take a second for questions on either of those topics before we go into the APPR. Yes, could you come to the mics so we can hear? It is being recorded, so we want to make sure everyone gets to hear the questions.
Than I did 2 weeks ago, I think. I have some real concerns about the system and whether everybody was ready for the system when it was implemented, and also what it means to different thinkers, kids on the spectrum, kids who have IEPs, kids who have behavioral problems, and I'm really concerned about that. Partly because it's, attached to a teacher, but partly because it makes those kids feel rotten to be judged and graded based on the fact that they can't sit for 90 minutes when they're 8 years old. That's a really hard thing. The book, the Pearson's book, thank you. The Pearson's book that they're using for third grade math, I had a nice little squidge at that today. And so he's sitting there and he's doing his homework as he was, came right off the bus, sat down, ate his snack, and he's doing his homework because we have after-school sports activities. So there isn't any other time. So he's now like, there is no playtime. So he had how much recess? 20, 30 minutes? 25 minutes of runaround time all day for a kid who does not sit. He doesn't sit in class. He doesn't sit at the table. He doesn't sit. He goes until he falls down, and then he sleeps, and then he wakes up and he goes all day. And that's the kid you're going to ask to sit for 90 minutes at a time, and that makes me very nervous. So he's answering a question, which I will try and condense. 3 kinds of bread, 4 kinds of filling, how many kinds of sandwiches? Okay, that seems like a pretty straightforward question. So he comes up with the first set, because I showed him how to make, sort of a graph, and here you go with the first of this, and now you multiply, and that's how you get it. He says, okay, and I went out to throw the ball for the dog, and I come back, and he's sitting at the table crying. And I'm like, what's the matter? And, you were doing fine. You were on the second to last question. It's been 20 minutes. What's going on? So he says, well, what if she wants rye on the bottom, but whole wheat on the top? And he has now figured out this whole thing. He's a different thinker. He is not going to answer the question. He will never answer the question that Pearson is asking him to answer. So what are we going to do with these kids aside from make them feel like dog poop? Because that's what he ends up sitting at the table crying, feeling like he can't do it.
I certainly appreciate your concerns. And in regards to your first comment where the concern about how this was put into place, I think Kelly spoke a little bit about this as a classroom teacher. You know, the appropriate thing to do with implementing new standards would have been you begin it in the kindergarten level and you bring those standards up, and students are then exposed to those spiraled standards as they move through. You don't necessarily put them in place where you have students in the middle who were working off prior standards, and now they're expected to transition to new standards where they certainly have gaps. And we saw a lot of those concerns, you know, for students, parents, and teachers, particularly in the grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, where there were a lot of shifts in math and in ELA. And there, you know, I think what you're referring to is the whole assessment piece. Now you're tying those skills that students really were not prepared for. As much as our teachers tried to, you can't fill in all of those gaps in a very limited amount of time. So with that said, you know, we're trying to do our best to make sure that we are making sure students are meeting those standards now, but there still will be students who have those gaps until you have all of them kind of building up through the way, quite honestly, it should have been implemented. In regards to the assessment piece, all students, you know, have to take the same assessments. And those assessments, I think you saw, are based on, this is the readability level for a 6th grade assessment. All students are expected to take that. We don't have much say in those. We have to administer them. Students have to take them. What I think is important is parents and teachers and as a district that we say to students that this is one measure. And if students are struggling with it, we reassure them that there's other things that we need to look at to make sure that, you know, you're enjoying school, that you're not getting so upset over a homework assignment or over assessments. We had a lot of students last year who were really stressed out about the assessments because they didn't finish them. I think, you know, with the scoring that we saw this year, I'm sure many of you have seen the results of Bethlehem. Certainly very good compared to the state, but I hardly agree with the fact that, you know, 50% of our students are not proficient in ELA and math, which is what the percentages show us. I don't have an easy answer because those things are unfortunately dictated by people higher than us. But I think that the concerns you have as a parent are the concerns that we all have as well. And not just a student who, you know, you're saying your child is active, he can't sit for that long. Very few 3rd graders could sit for 90 minutes, and very few adults can sit for that amount of time. So we recognize that is certainly a concern, and I think the more we want to encourage students to do their best, certainly, but the more we can also say, if you didn't do well, don't worry about it. There's a lot of other things that are relevant in school and in life. Maybe that will help. Again, I don't have a great answer for that.
Is there any future flexibility with it? Is there any possibility for building in increasing amounts of flexibility for which students might exempt out? Or
Not unless the state is willing to make those changes. Unfortunately, we're dictated by those requirements from the state. So if you can get the state to change it, wonderful. We'll definitely support that.
Good evening. It's nice to see so many of the people who took a great part and were integral to my daughter's educational development. I'm very proud to be in the school district, so I compliment everybody. I was just wondering, really quick question, with respect to the Regents exams and AP placement exams, are they going to correlate to these changes? And if so, is it going to happen right away, or is it going to take some time? Thank you.
The first change, they are transitioning. The Common Core is beginning. If you have students in 9th grade, students are actually being instructed with the Common Core standards this year. The first Common Core exam will be happening in algebra. So any student enrolled in algebra, whether that's a middle school child or a freshman, will be taking, don't shoot me up here. Middle school students will be taking the Common Core algebra exam. However, the state is still offering for 1 year that students will still be eligible to take the integrated algebra exam. They're 3 weeks apart. The Common Core algebra exam will be administered June 3rd. June 3rd. The past Regents exam, the kind of traditional what we've had, integrated algebra, will be offered during the traditional Regents week. So students in the middle school who are in the accelerated program will all take that Common Core algebra exam the beginning of June. The issue with the 9th grade students is that they do have the option to take the integrated algebra still, and what we would recommend is that they take the Common Core exam. They're required to take that. We would recommend that if they didn't perform well, they take the integrated algebra 3 weeks later, because we haven't seen the Common Core algebra exam. We don't know how it's going to be scaled. We don't know how those grades are going to perform, and concerns obviously over how the 8th grade exams were scored this year. We want to make sure students have the best opportunity to get the best grade for that, because that will be on their transcripts. The problem we face is that we will not have the results of the Common Core algebra exam back prior to the administration of the integrated algebra exam. So, So our recommendation would be that those students plan to take both exams in June, because to give them the best opportunity to get the best grade. So that certainly, if students don't want to take it, we're not going to force them, but it's in their best interest, and if the state can't provide us with the scores for the Common Core exam prior to that exam, that would be our recommendation. The Common Core English, students in 11th grade will still take the traditional Regents exam. The first group of students to take the Common Core Regents exam are this year's 9th graders.
Hi, Jody. So hold on a minute. I have a kid in the situation you just spoke about. They also have to take the 8th grade New York State test, so you're saying 3.
Well, that's why if they're a middle school student, we're not recommending that they take also the integrated algebra. We're recommending they take the Common Core algebra exam, and also they are required because of federal regulations, are required to take the Math 8 exam still, which happens earlier in the year. So we don't want them to have to take 3 different exams. We think that those students, because they've been in the midst of Common Core instruction, that they will be prepared for that Common Core exam as a middle school student for the algebra. So we don't feel that they need to take the integrated algebra exam, but they still will be required to take the Math 8, unless the federal government eases up on that requirement.
Oh, they're shut down right now. Well, the other thing that I think I'm really worried about is, let's say in my situation, and I don't just mean to speak about me, but my daughter is on the 2nd year of advanced, 3rd year in advanced math in middle school, but each of those classes have been 33 kids, and so now we're in the era of, continued budget constraints, bigger classes, less aides, less helpers, and apparently less instruction time, so, because you're just jamming all this stuff in there.
You mean with testing?
So I'm worried about, the stress level is just incredible during this testing stuff, and I'm ready to just go bring these tests to Commissioner King's house in Slingerlands when they come home to me. Yeah, I will.
His kids don't have to take them. So.
No, they don't go to our school. But anyway, I think that I would like to see if there's somehow, I am really upset about this being not phased in, just being jammed on these kids, but it would be great if, I don't know, can you speak about in the budget process if there will be any accommodations of reducing class size? Again, 33 kids in advanced math when they have additional curricular requirements forced upon them, and I don't speak the same Common Core language. I learned the tricks, and it's constantly I'm going to look at that resource from Westchester County BOCES, but we're not. My husband and I are fairly well educated. We know math. We do it all the time. But when we don't speak the same language, we have a communication impediment between our children, and that stresses it out even more.
I can address the concern about trying to jam it all in. Dave has worked with our math teachers, and I don't know, Dave, if you want to maybe speak to that, about aligning our curriculum so we are sure that we're addressing the things that need to be covered prior to the test administration. The one unknown we still face is we have not seen a sample of the actual new Common Core algebra exam. So we're same situation we were in with the 3 through 8 exams. We're taking, the information that we have and we're mapping out our curriculum in the way we think it makes the most sense, in the way we think students will be assessed. But we don't have a lot of guidance on that right now.
And we don't have a lot of resources to reduce our sizes, to make sure every kid gets it before they move on. I mean, I know that there have been a lot of times when my children, more so my younger child, has come home, I'm in elementary, and he'd be like, I don't really understand this. We went over it, went quick, we had so much to cover in class, and so we're doing the teaching, and we're not communicating the same way that my math
Sure.
teachers are teaching.
Sure.
So if you guys can give us something so we can speak the same language, or if you guys could somehow reduce, God hit me, the class sizes, I'd really appreciate it. 33 kids is a lot for advanced math.
Okay, thank you. Question over here?
Hi, I was not familiar with the Common Core for the math guiding principles, and I actually like them very much. I understand there'll be a lot of trouble as we transition to it. But I'm mostly concerned about the Common Core for the ELA. I like a lot of it, and I like the increased difficulty in the close reading. I had a quick question about the common text, and I wonder if that will result at the middle school in the class reading the same text. We're in our 6th year at the middle school, and our daughter, like 5 or 6 years ago, there's a lot of groups, and they're just choosing what books they're reading, and it's mostly a group discussion. That's one of my questions. The main question I have with the Common Core is, while I think there is a lot of really great narrative nonfiction and very high-quality nonfiction, I feel a great concern over the percentages of 11th and 12th grade, the 75% nonfiction, and the loss of what reading novels is going to mean for the education in kind of talking about the human condition and kind of the understanding the emotional underpinnings and creativity and empathy. And I think our society is definitely developing very, very quickly, and there's a lot of screen time, and there's concerns I have that people are not as empathetic. And I wondered if our district shares that concern and how they might still bring, how they're going to do it, and what's going to look like in 11th and 12th grade.
So in regards to your question about, the text students are reading, what Mike spoke about, the Lexile levels and how to use those as a gauge. When you talk about students selecting their own text for reading enjoyment, the guide is really to make sure students are reading at what we call an independent reading level, so that they're not reading text that's too difficult. And I say that carefully, because if a student is very motivated and has an interest in a topic, we don't want to discourage them, but we also don't want students to be reading texts that are way above their level, because research indicates that students who are not reading at that independent level with accuracy are not actually improving their reading. So that piece where students are selecting their own, we are, and we will still encourage teachers and students to work within those frameworks to help students select texts that are appropriate. And also, as parents, if you know about where your student is in a range, a Lexile range, a grade level, you can help your student make sure that what they're reading at home is that independent reading level. And in regards to class text, that would be done, those may be more challenging reading levels, but the teacher is there to support a student in that type of reading. They're not necessarily able to support them in an independent reading. In regards to the literature, we very much are concerned about maintaining some of what we've always done. We don't think we should throw everything out with a Common Core. We have a very strong literature piece in our curriculum, and we intend to maintain that. But as Andy indicated, and Nick and Jen, a lot of that nonfiction and informational text within the Common Core is also a component of science and social studies in other areas. So we don't intend to take all the literature out of our ELA curriculum in order to make sure we're meeting those percentages, because other areas are doing a lot of that reading as well. So we think that we have, we're still making our shifts in our curriculum, but we think that we have a balanced approach in that and want to maintain that.
Can you just comment on how the 11th and 12th grade will look this year with the Common, so last year was the first year with Common Core?
This year is the first year in 9th grade, so 11th and 12th grade will still look the same as it has been in the past, because those students in 11th grade are still taking the comprehensive Regents exam. They're not taking the Common Core Regents exam.
Okay. So it's going to be another
2 years.
2 years. What do you envision it looking like as far as like how many novels a student in 11th and 12th grade reads now versus under the Common Core? Because I understand that. I'm glad to hear that, some of the balance, some of that percentage will be taken up in other classes, but I'd like to understand a little bit more, if you can give me some specifics, what it would look like.
You want to take that because you've been...
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's hard to quantify in terms of amounts. I mean, I can't sit up here and tell you we're going to have X minutes with this or X number of pages with this. It's not easily quantifiable. But with regard to the Common Core instruction and changes in the curriculum at the high school, we've put things in place in the last couple of years. We have required writing prompts in the 3 areas of the Common Core with common assessments so that we can track student performance and be able to get formative data on how we can provide better instruction for writing. We're continuing to build our research component. That piece is going to continue to receive work, and we'll be developing that as we go forward. In terms of reading, we still have a program that's balanced between literature and informational reading. We will look to be having teachers, and they currently are, incorporating informational text as companion to the literature that they're doing. That's generally of a higher lexile level so that it's done in an instructional setting. That is something that's going to be more standardized as we move forward in terms of deciding how much and that we're achieving the balance that's desired by the Common Core. A lot of it is that we know our kids can read well, but it's about being strategic and teaching them skills that are of a higher level and more sophisticated, so that when they're looking at, for example, they're reading, Lord of the Flies, a teacher would pull in an article that's going to give them informational text that's a companion to that literature that will be of a higher level, that will require them to pull out statistics and analyze data and weigh arguments and authors' claims. And so the piece there isn't so much to say we're going to do half, it's going to be smarter than just saying, a number. And that's what our students need in this district. So, I can assure you that our literature program is strong and will continue to be strong, and we will augment it with what's needed by the Common Core. Thanks, Jim.
We're going to take one more question, and then I'm going to go into the APPR. And we will have a time after that for additional questions that you may have related to testing, Common Core, or APPR. So one more question?
One second. If any
Sure.
of you want a card to write a question on, please raise your hand and I can give it to you. We can answer either the question at the end or on the website at a later date.
Okay. So you want to wait?
Yeah, because it is about standardized testing.
Okay. Sure.
Can I ask a question then?
Could you
Since you
wait?
didn't have one. Okay.
Do you mind waiting?
Sure.
I'll be quick. Okay, so the APPR, not to be confused with AARP, is the new teacher evaluation system that was put into place really 2 years ago, but full implementation this past year in 12-13. You may not know this, but districts have always had APPR plans in place. It's basically the evaluation system. What's different about the new system is that it's very structured, and that there are more strict requirements as to what has to be included as part of that. Part of the evaluation systems are directly tied to student testing, and it's part of the federal Race to the Top. What used to be No Child Left Behind is now Race to the Top, and this came out of that as a federal requirement, and states who received that money needed to put this into place. The goal, obviously, was to improve the quality of instruction and student performance performance for college and career readiness. So these are the effectiveness scales that we're required to use under the new APPR. You can see they're broken up into 4 categories: highly effective, effective, developing, and ineffective. And I'm going to go back to those at the end, but I wanted to give you a sense of what those scoring ranges are. It's out of a 100-point scale. So the teachers are evaluated under 60% of classroom observations and evaluations that happen throughout the year. As I mentioned, 20% is student growth or performance by students on state assessments, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. And 20% for student achievement, called the local measure. So for our observations and evaluations here in Bethlehem, and every district is different, we observe teachers a minimum of 3 to 4 times annually. They receive a score out of 60 points out of 100 for those observations and evaluations that take place during the year. And teachers are observed using a rubric in the 4 areas they're evaluated on. This, again, varies from district to district because there were different rubrics that could be selected. Our planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. The local measure is a measure that you could use either growth or achievement. It's worth 20 points or 20%. It needs to be agreed upon. We have actually an APPR committee in our district that has been very active for the last couple of years. Last year, we used mid-course assessments. We decided for our local measure we were going to use a growth model. You probably know students took pre-assessments at the very beginning of the year or the course. In that mid-course assessment was the local measure. How much did that student grow from the beginning of the year to that midpoint of the course? We recognize with all of the increases in state assessments that students were being tested way too much, and just like you were very sensitive to that. So this year in 2014, we changed that process. We're not doing pre-assessments. We're using prior year test data. And instead, we're doing building level scores. So if you're a teacher at the middle school, we do an achievement measure of the state testing, our 6 through 8, science, ELA, and math. And every teacher in the building will get the same score. The next piece of it, the other 20%, gets a little tricky because these are the scores that are the state measure. However, they're not really the state measure for most teachers. Our 4 through 8 ELA and math teachers are the only teachers who actually get a standardized score on this 20%, meaning they're judged, they're scored, evaluated on the ELA and math exams, and the state gives them a score out of 20 points for those exams. Our K2 teachers, you heard, we referenced it earlier, are using the ELA and math assessments on Ames Web, which is a nationally normed assessment program. In all of our other teachers, actually, we have department-developed end-of-year assessments. So even though it's called a SLO, a student learning objective, or a state measure, the majority of our tests are actually locally developed, and we have to generate scales as to how much growth those students make converts to a number on a 20-point scale. So with all that, you've got the 60% for the evaluations, your 20% for the local measure, which this year will be a building score, and then 20% for your SLO or your student learning objective. And that then translates into one of these categories for between 91 and 100, 75 and 90, 65 to 74, or 0 to 64. And every teacher gets that total score with a rating attached to that. So you've probably heard a lot about this. This kind of all gets mixed together with Common Core testing, the teacher evaluation system. And the one thing I would say that I think a lot of our faculty administrators would concur is one of the things that has improved with the APPR is there are more frequent observations and evaluations. There's more discussions among administrators and teachers about what's going on in the classrooms, more productive conversations. So I think that overall has been good, that local, that 60% we're using for the observation and evaluation process. Some of the the obstacles or the problems we've had with this is that even though this is a statewide initiative, every district is doing this a little bit differently. Every district develops their own scales. Every district develops their own growth targets. So when you're comparing, for example, Bethlehem to Voorheesville to Guilderland, those scales could be totally different, and so it's very hard to make those comparisons among districts, which happens a lot in the media. There's disparity in the way groups of teachers receive scores, meaning that, for example, I mentioned our 4 through 8 teachers are all scored based on those state assessments, where other teachers are developing their own assessments or departmental assessments, where other teachers are using Ames Web, which are nationally normed assessments. So in regards to how those numbers play out in the teacher scores is not equal across all the teachers K through 12. The other problem we faced this year is with our 4 through 8 teacher scores that we receive, they have an adjustment factor, meaning a kind of a margin of error. So every student gets a score, but it's what they call an adjusted or an unadjusted score. The problem we have this year is that we only received unadjusted score, and I can kind of break this down to give you an example of, a simple example. If your student takes a test in a class, let's say he's in Dave Round's class, and Dave grades the test, and Dave says you have between a 75 and an 85. So there's a 10-point range there. That's the kind of score we have or we've received from state ed for our 4 through 8 teachers. So the other piece of that is that, let's say the same student goes to Mr. Rounds and says, well, I think you made an error because a couple of these questions are right. Once the data is done, meaning it's already gone to state ed, they've already done it, they won't make any corrections to it. So the concern we have this year with the 4 through 8 scores is that we really have no way to validate if those scores are accurate or not, because they're all done in ranges. So that presents a little bit of a problem for us. And the other piece, which was already mentioned, is teachers who teach at-risk special education students or ESL students are still held to the same standards, and they may not make the same growth, so those teachers may be hurt by those overall growth scores that are assigned to them. And again, just between districts, it's the same teacher doing the same work in one district could be deemed highly effective. In another district, they could be deemed developing, depending upon what kind of assessments are used, what kind of scores are used, and how those scales are actually developed in the district. And I want to ask Dave to comment a little bit more from a teacher perspective on this piece.
My name is David Rounds, and I'm a U.S. history teacher at the high school. I'm also the president of the Teachers Association. So I've worked very closely with Jody, the administration, and the teachers in the school district to help develop our APPR plan. And I would say that Jody kind of hit the nail right on the head when she said that the kind of the strongest part of this is the 60% piece, the piece that we had control over, the local piece, because it really has led to more observations, more direct feedback to teachers, constructive feedback to teachers in terms of what's actually going on in the classroom, the stuff that affects your children the most. So that part of the APPR plan by far is the strength of the program, and it is better than what we used to do. We've always had an APPR plan, as Jody mentioned, but it was weaker than what we have right now in terms of the observation piece, and that certainly holds us as professionals more accountable. But in addition to that, it gives us constructive feedback that in the past was lacking. I wish I could say the same for the other pieces of it. Jody mentioned that we've reduced the testing involved in the local piece. That was another thing that we felt we absolutely had to do. You all have children in the school district. You understood last year on the first day of school, we're testing first graders in physical education. We're testing them in art. We're testing them in LMC. We're testing them in everything. They were just buried by test. And as parents and as educators, we felt horrible about that. But at the time, that was the only way we knew that we could implement the APPR program and meet the standards of the state. There's been a little bit of flexibility introduced, plus, frankly, we've made some pretty bold moves to make the 20% local piece a lot more student-friendly, but at the same time, give us the information we need and kind of reduce the stress level that so many of them felt. The 20% piece that's tied to the state is, I think, the piece that most of you as parents probably have concerns about, and I know as a professional, I do. We need to have some type of standardized testing. I don't think anybody denies that it has some value. The concern to me, as a high school teacher and just as the president of the union, is it seems that we've reversed testing in the state a little bit. Think of this concept for a second. The teachers in the state of New York received a growth score based on your children's performance almost a month and a half before the results for your children were even mailed out. Okay, think about the priority right there for a second. Okay, and the sense, I think, across the state is a lot of the standardized testing is no longer about giving the feedback that you as parents and we as professionals need. It's really kind of turned into, we're now using standardized testing to validate whether or not somebody is or isn't doing their job. Okay, and that's a concern, which I think many of you are parents and us as professionals, we've been kind of asking the state to slow down, do this right, do the testing piece right. We all think that testing is important if you do it for the right reasons and with the right focus. Okay, right now, too much of it is emphasized on statistical analysis, statistical breakdown, not of the students. There was a day when our elementary teachers would find out how their kids actually performed on the test. And you as parents could get some information about why they got a 3 on a math test or why they got a 2 on a math test. That doesn't happen anymore. Okay? This school district receives no feedback whatsoever on what areas that your students, our students, your children are struggling in. So it gives us no chance to really address the weaknesses of our program. There is absolutely a time and place for the standardized testing in this school district and in the state, but from our perspective, we've been really pushing the state hard with the help of parents to kind of slow this down and put the priority in the right place, which is giving us feedback that's actually going to help your children perform better. The reality is the 60% piece of the observations so much better than what we had in the past. The 20% local piece, I think last year we did an okay job managing it. I think we've made some significant improvements to it already that have made it better this year. The 20% piece is going to be a work in progress for years. And the one thing I appreciate is that the district, the teachers, we've had a great relationship in trying to get through this in a professional manner that holds us accountable, but at the same time, try to implement it in a way that has the least harmful impact on your children. And we're going to continue to do that. Jody and I met for an hour today to kind of sort through the bureaucracy of that 20% piece, okay, the SLO piece, the state piece, to try to make sense of it, to try to give us the information we need, but at the same time, send a message to the state that you got this wrong right here. You got to slow down. You got to implement it right. And a lot of that ties into what the message you have sent about the core standards. Many of you support the Common Core standards. You support APPR and the changes made, but slow it down, do it right, rather than kind of rush it just to say that you've got it done. And that's a message that, as the local president, we constantly are in contact with the politicians saying, we're not afraid of this, we're not avoiding it, we just want to do it right. And I think that's the approach that Jody has taken when she's worked with us in developing this.
So the final piece in the APPR is that teacher APPR scores can be requested by parents for this school year, or from last school year. So they're not considered foilable. However, parents may request, and there's information on our website about how you go about doing that you can request the composite score, meaning that full score out of 100 for the teacher that your child currently has this year. They'll be released later in October. Our deadline is October 18th that we have to submit those scores to state ed. And then if you want to request these scores, you would do so at the building level. There's a district form, however, like I said, that will be on our website, and information about how you would go about requesting those. And then you would go into the building to actually get that score, again, out of 100. However, if there is an appeal, meaning a teacher, as I mentioned, we have some questions about the 4 through 8 scores because we can't validate them, and there is a process a right that teachers have to appeal their score. So if there is an actual appeal going on, those scores would not be released, obviously, until that process was over. Again, I would really just, want to emphasize that getting the total score doesn't give you a lot of information about a lot of other components of that. And we're not allowed to speak to those issues. We're only allowed to provide you with that total score. We're not allowed to provide you the makeup of the class, or maybe students didn't finish an assessment, or a lot of those factors that you all know go into assessments and how those may be related to the scale scored. With that, you've all been a very patient audience, but we do have a few more minutes for questions, but I want to turn it over quickly to Dr. Douglas for some last comments, and if you have additional questions, again, you can either hand them to Saber, she's walking around on index cards, or come to the mic.
Thank you, Jody and Dave. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to again, just before we end tonight, thank you for coming out, because it really takes an involved and engaged community, as well as you can see, an involved, engaged staff here at the district to work through these reform agendas. The big thing is, I think what Dave emphasized, is we are in a society right now where we're not really against the Common Core. We're not against the APPR. We just want to do everything the best possible way that we can. And we need to make sure that testing serves education and not the other way around, education serving testing. And that's really the focus of our conversation tonight. On behalf of the Board of Education, I know some are here, we would all like to thank you for participating in this. And if you look at your clocks right now, you have just sat through roughly a 90-minute session that our 3 through 8th grade students would have to sit through. So we want to end it with any questions that you have. Also, if you have taken a card, if we do not get to those, we'll offer about roughly 10 minutes if we can tonight, because we know everybody has to get home as well. Please make sure that we get the cards. We will compile those questions and answers and also put them up on the website so that everyone can glean the information. Please go out and share this with others in the community, as I know there are many that could not be here tonight that probably would like to be here, and that the video of this presentation is out there. So on behalf, again, of the Board of Education, myself, I'd like to thank all the supervisors, the teachers, the CSE chairs, the Division of Special Education that are here, our principals, middle school, high school. I know Mr. Landry is in the back as well, our communication, and especially Jody for making tonight possible. And thank you for everything that you do day in and day out for the kids. So thank you very much. So if you do have any questions for those that are able to stay around, please feel free, come up to the mic. We'll start right over here.
Thank you very much. I know that last year, students that didn't meet the state standards were eligible for academic intervention services. I know that this year the state has allowed flexibility, given the fact that there's a large percentage of kids statewide who have not made those standards. I was wondering if Bethlehem has made a decision with respect to the students that will qualify for those services, and if so, if I could hear how that decision was made. Thank you.
Sure. We obviously looked at the state did put out conversion charts on how you take the last year's scaled scores and this year's, but we also have other measures that we use when students don't perform well on the state assessments. Again, I want to emphasize it's one measure. So we never had just used that one measure as a qualifier for AIS. Now we have an RTI, response to intervention program. So what we'll use is we look at that state assessment as here's how they performed on this measure. Then we'll look at, and if they're in the elementary school, we'll look at how are they performing on the Ames Web assessments, which are nationally normed in reading and math. And then we also will do Fountas and Pinnell, which is a reading assessment that's more in depth. And we'll look at those as comprehensive measures to see if the student is truly underperforming in all of those areas, the teacher is concerned, we would then look at that student as either getting intervention from the classroom teacher or perhaps getting intervention from a specialist, a reading teacher or a math AIS teacher. The same will be true at the middle school. We'll use the state assessments as well as the Scholastic Reading and Math Inventory, and we have additional assessments there that we might look to. So it's not just one measure and you're flagged already, because there's a lot of pieces as to why a student maybe did not perform well on those assessments. So we look at more than one measure and then determine how much intervention does a child need. They may need something very specific. It may last for 12 weeks. It may last for a quarter at the middle school. And parents would be notified what kind of intervention or for how long we might anticipate a student needing those services.
So what? No, and I can appreciate that. I'm concerned because I think there's an acknowledgement that the standards have increased, and I'm just hopeful that the district will provide the services that are necessary for the kids to get to that level. And if a decision is made to, given the flexibility, to reduce the amount of students that receive the academic intervention services, I'm curious as to what's going to happen next year for those kids.
Yeah, we share those same concerns.
Hi. I have 2 children in the middle school, and I am very pleased with the Common Core because I think when you raise the bar, children will rise to it. I do want to ask specifically, it says presenting claims and findings to others orally is going to be a part of the 6th grade, as well as writing brief reports. I'd like to know how that's going to work in the middle school, mostly because last year my children wrote research projects in science and social studies. There was one for each in science and one in social studies. It was a 3 to 4 page project, and it took about 4 weeks to come back with no marks on the paper other than nice job. What I'd like to ask is, are we going to move to, say, weekly or bi-weekly paragraphs that are on a topic that will actually not only be graded on the concept and the ability to pull a thought together and present a topic, but also the grammar and the structure of that paragraph? I'm just wondering where we're headed, because when we say we're writing more, there needs to be that feedback, and it needs to be pretty quick turnaround in order for the child to practice more and more. And again, the oral presentations, wonderful. It's great that we're being asked to do them. I think we all need to be able to stand up and voice our opinions. It's fabulous that you're doing it tonight and giving us this opportunity. I just wonder how you're going to put that into the curriculum in middle school. And it's just a question. I just wonder, we all know how much time it takes to grade paragraphs. I teach, so I know. It takes a long time. I just want to make sure I understand how it'll be implemented instead of a big chunk research project. If throughout the year you're thinking, all right, we have to do this weekly or bi-weekly.
I'll address part of that, and then I'll let Mr. Baker and Ms. Bell, our language supervisor, also to talk about how we're incorporating some of those skills into other areas.
Great.
There is still a research component, and there will be a research component that we'll do within the middle school, whether that's in science, social studies, ELA. However, the Common Core does address that very specific thing, that you should be doing more writing more frequently, shorter pieces of writing, and giving kids more quick and immediate feedback. So that's something that we have been building into our revised curriculum that's aligned to the Common Core.
And
so
the revised curriculum starts this year?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So that will be happening more frequently. We also have more common writing assessments, prompts and assessments that all the grade levels will be doing that are based on Teachers College, which we model a lot of our curriculum on. But I'm going to turn it over just quickly to Andy and Marisa to talk about those other pieces that you asked about for clarification.
Yeah, just to elaborate, I was going to mention the writing prompts that we have, where again, teachers doing, actually it's a building-wide initiative we started a couple years ago, where all content area teachers are doing writing pieces that are scored on a common rubric and in specific areas. In regards to mechanics, you talk about grammar, mechanics being one of the components of the rubric, which we can then provide feedback and look at the data and see where students are needing, some more intervention. In regards to oral reports, I think one of the shifts is that there's less of the big, going to get up and do a big half-hour presentation every 20 weeks, and more of the focus on students practicing those skills, more frequently in even less formal settings. It could be small group work, could be turn and talking to a partner. That's the whole piece about claims. It could be looking at a close reading. And again, all of these standards, how they manifest themselves in classroom instruction is very complex, and there's many different facets to it that we're consistently working to address. So I'll also turn it over to Dr. Bell with some more thoughts.
In the World Language Department, we've just started in 6th grade to include some of the Common Core ELA standards and embed those within the language program.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly, it'll start in 6th grade where students will be working on collaborative research projects that all include a listening and speaking component, which will happen in English in the lower grades, and then as they go through the language program, will happen more in the target language, where they start to give more presentations in the target language. But in 6th grade, for example, next week, our students will be doing a research project in the library in groups where they investigate the value of learning languages for their careers. And then each one of those Common Core projects we have in 6th grade, of which there will be 3 or 4, includes an opportunity for them to speak. And it won't necessarily always be in front of the classroom, because in middle school that's very stressful. But sometimes it will be that they may be doing a paired presentation, or maybe like a little presentation where students go from group to group and learn, and they speak to one another. So sometimes it will be whole class, but other times it will be to their peers, and we'll actually speak with them about what are good methods that they can use to present themselves clearly and articulately. So those types of things I think are being embedded in a lot of the content areas, not just in language, but that is one example of where the listening speaking strand is being met a little bit more.
Great. Thank you for answering that. I just have one final comment. As an engineer, I love rubrics. I mean, it's great. As a teacher, it helps me preset the kids for what I want them to do and how to be successful. But as a parent, to get back a 3 to 4 page research paper and to have nothing written personally to your child, there's a little bit missing. And I do understand how much time it takes. I really do. I just want us to be careful with that, because they are young and impressionable, and we can have a very positive effect with just a sentence of, I see how much work you put into this, period.
Absolutely. Feedback is critical. Appreciate that. Okay.
Hi. I'm interested to hear some ideas of things we can advocate for through the budget process to help our students succeed in the Common Core environment.
Is that a trap?
I'm thinking of things like more academic intervention staff, more money for manipulatives in math at the elementary level. Clearly, there's a lot more intensity in the information they're expected to master. And having been involved in the budgeting process in the past, I think a lot of folks here could really bring some good advocacy work to help our students succeed in the Common Core world, because I think it does take resources. I guess I was thinking more of, as a taxpayer, what can I come to the board meetings and advocate for through the budget process?
Hello. I have two comments and one comment and two questions, and around the mathematics. And I really appreciate the focus on understanding and focused on understanding in the math and problem solving there. And I think it makes it all the more important the types of questions that are being asked. And so my question is around curriculum. Is the curriculum common between schools at the elementary level? And second is, what's the process for feedback and improvement of that curriculum? I've been starting to collect questions that are coming home on my daughter's 5th grade math that make absolutely no sense. And as a person who spends his day using advanced mathematics and coaching people on making better data-driven decisions, that's what I do. And for example, adding the rainfall in Atlanta to the rainfall in San Diego on the same day, and have my daughter say, why would you ever add the rainfall on 2 days in 2 different cities? And so we tried to construct a problem, you know. Bob spent part of the day with a bucket in San Diego, and then he flew out to Atlanta, you know. I mean, it was impossible, right? So what's the process for improving the curriculum so that a year from now, we can say, okay, the curriculum's getting better?
We actually are ahead of the game in terms of the curriculum aspect. We started Common Core planning 3 years ago. Our kindergarten, 1st and 2nd graders actually started Common Core a year early, hoping to give a jump start to eliminate some of the gaps. And then last year we kicked it in 3 through 8. So K-1-2, this is the 3rd year in sort of a tweaking process. We do hold what are called cabinet meetings, where a teacher from each building comes together at each grade level, and we sit and we talk about curriculum. We do summer curriculum time where we work on revamping curriculum. But I'm always looking for feedback from teachers, you know, in terms of how did this unit go? What are some strengths of the unit? What are some weaknesses of the unit? What are the gaps that are still present? So we are continually looking to revise curriculum. All of the buildings are using the same curriculum maps. In terms of, we're using common assessments every 10 weeks or so. In the past 2 years, each building has given every student in the building a common math assessment. And then off of those assessments, we're able to have communication within the building. How did your students do on this type of question versus that type of question compared to mine? So that teachers could find where you know, their instructional strengths and weaknesses were. Teachers also talked from building to building to see if certain buildings were performing higher on questions than others, so that if a certain building performed very poorly on one question, they could talk to teachers in another building to come up with instructional strategies. It's certainly a growing process. This isn't something that you can fix overnight, but I think our K-1-2 teachers are certainly seeing a difference because it's their 3rd year going through it. 3, 4, 5, they're going to struggle with it probably for another year or two because the students coming to them don't have the entire background that's necessary. So I think next year is when the 3rd grade, which is the testing year, that's the first group of students that are going to have only seen Common Core. And I think then we can make you know, a better assessment in terms of how the curriculum is working. But it's always a work in progress, and that has nothing to do with Common Core. We've always, through the years, take a look at how did things perform this year, what are things we can improve upon, where are our strengths, where are weaknesses. We were able to, through an outside vendor, get actually some valid data on our state tests, so we can now look back and see what standards our students performed strongly on, poorly on, not just as a general number, but in comparison to students that scored at, say, a level 3. We now know how our students performed on a particular standard and whether or not they were at a sort of proficient level that level 3 students were able to score on. So it's an ongoing process. We have different committees that are working on it. It's just a constant communication.
I admire your process. I guess let's follow up afterwards.
Hi, I'm a Glenmont parent and a new middle school parent. And
I guess I don't know if it's a question or more of a comment. My concern is that with all this focus on testing, and in terms of how the core curriculum gets translated into the classroom, I know that there's a whole cottage industry springing up all over the country of vendors who are developing curriculum and tests. And I think that my kids, and probably everyone's kids, learn better when they have teachers that are enthusiastic, that are creative, that bring their own individual skills and talents to the classroom. Is there still going to be room for teachers, especially I think with the younger grades, because that's where my experience is at this point, to be able to use their own individual creativity in the classrooms while they're plugging in the core curriculum and getting everyone ready for standardized tests? Because it would be, I think, a real shame to lose that, especially from this school district. Thank you.
To be honest with you, that has been more limited because of the changes in the Common Core and testing. But do I believe that teachers still have the autonomy to bring their own creativity into the classroom? Absolutely. We don't follow a prescribed program. I know what you're talking about. I get 5,000 emails a day about a new series that's out and what's great, the latest and greatest. But we, in our curriculum for ELA and ELA specifically, we use the models that are outlined by Teachers College, which is all research-based. It is aligned to the Common Core, but there's no prescribed program and you have to stick to day one, you're here. We don't follow a specific phonics program in the primary grades. So teachers do have the latitude to bring their skills or their craft, their creativity into the classroom within the context, however, of the units that are required to teach. I know that there's a lot of districts who do a lot of test prep. They spend weeks on test preparation. In this district, that doesn't happen. We think that our curriculum is strong and is solid, and it is aligned appropriately to the standards, whether it was the old standards or the new standards. But there is more of an emphasis on testing, and so the one thing that I would say has shifted is that particularly in the elementary schools, just because we have 5 of them, that alignment is definitely more structured than it has been in the past, meaning the units Dave mentioned, common math assessments. In order to do that, teachers have to be at a relatively similar place in their units in order to administer those and get good data. But how the teachers deliver that in the classroom is really up to them. So I think that you're right in the fact that some of that has been reduced because we do have more guidelines which we need to follow, but I don't think that students are missing out on that creative nature of the classroom and things that teachers really love to do. I think there's still the ability to do that.
I just wanted to add a quick math piece. The Common Core actually encourages alternative approaches in math. It's gotten away from this is the addition algorithm, this is the division algorithm. It's more about finding different ways to solve problems and then convince others that your solution is valid. So that goes back to, I guess, the oral argument part. Ideally in a classroom, you'd have 10 different students solving the problem 10 different ways and then have to convince each other why their solution is correct. So the Common Core in math actually encourages alternative methods and doesn't try to pigeonhole people. The concepts are what are constant, but not how teachers explain it or how students figure it out on their own.
Last question.
All right, yes. We've had a lot of very thoughtful questions that actually will require more in-depth answers. So I'm just going to read one at this point, and we're going to answer the rest of them on our website so we can get more in-depth responses for you. So this question is, when did the district receive the spring 2013 scores? And when will parents receive these scores? And will the process become more timely?
Is that a loaded question? I believe we received the scores, the scale scores and the levels. We don't get the parent reports. At the early August, right about the first week in August, we received that information. And when we first receive them, it's embargoed and they're not released to the public. The parent reports actually are not sent out through the district. They're sent out through BOCES. and they contract with a third-party vendor. So that delay in parents getting the actual parent reports is because of state ed has to send the data to NARIC, which has to send the data through another third-party vendor, and it gets a little complicated. And my understanding for the delay this year, when there was a delay last year, was because of the way the data was sent from the state education department to the BOCES was not in a format that could be easily transferred to the vendor. So will it become more timely? We're looking actually for next year with a new management system. We're looking for a way that when we get the scores, we could at least provide it through that new system. It'll so you can actually at least see how your child did in the scale score and the level. It won't be that parent report because we don't have those until those are generated by this other vendor. But we are looking from those data files to be able to upload that to our student information system. So at the very least, you would have that information, before going into the school year or, a month and a half into the school year. So we are looking at a way to expedite that process on our end. As for, the other piece of it, the parent reports, I can't say if that'll be more timely or not.
Thank you. I just wanted to say if anybody has another question on the card, just come up to the front and hand it to us on your way out. I also wanted to make note, I saw a lot of the guides on the table outside per grade were out. They're also available on our district website under the academic section on the Common Core page. And they're actually a little bit extended. They're 4 pages instead of 2, the ones out here. So if you even want a little bit more detail, go to our website because that resource is there. And there are also more resources about Common Core there as well.
Really, again, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I appreciate your attention. And if you have any questions, you can certainly contact me as we move through this together. So thank you.